Hey everyone, Trump's family separation policies. Can it happen here? And whether remaining civil is the real imperative in ugly times. That's what we're going to be talking about today on Rise Like Lions. Imagine for a second that our government started torturing people when they crossed the border without documentation or when they presented themselves seeking asylum with their children. And imagine that we not only tortured the parents who brought children with them, but also the children that were accompanying them as a way to terrify potential asylum seekers or border crossers. And imagine that the White House Chief of Staff, John Kelly, defended that kind of atrocity with rhetoric like, say, a big name of the game is deterrence. The big point is that they elected to come illegally into the United States, and this is a technique that no one hopes will be used extensively or for very long, but that's the name of the game. And now imagine that Jeff Sessions, our Attorney General, defended that policy of torture with statements like, well, as Romans 13 says, rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Terror is a biblical tool used by the state and ordained by God in service of law and order. Imagine he said something like that. Now, one hopes that that kind of policy and that kind of rhetoric would be received with scorn, as it should, from all sides of the political debate. And one would hope that national newspapers of record would not waste column inches calling for civility in the face of an atrocity like that. And one would hope that, that the nice old lady at the coffee shop or the cafe and her husband would, even if they were in deep Republican territory, speak up and say that it's wrong to torture or damage people just to teach them respect for law or to obey the government. And we would hope that her husband wouldn't say something like, if you don't want to get tortured, don't come here. Well, less than a week ago, I sat in a cafe with some friends in Fort Stockton, just a short drive from Trump's child internment camp in Tornillo, Texas. And I listened to a group of older white folks wearing Make America Great Again hats, chastising the families who were being detained and saying things like, you need to stay in your own country and make it better. And if you don't want to be separated from your kids, don't come here. And a few short days later, the New York Times published a piece originally titled, In the Era of Trump, Incivility Spreads in a Divided Nation. And my social media feed has been filled with friends wagging fingers at people on the left who called the child separation policy a Nazi policy or compared Trump to a Nazi. And they did this despite the fact that just a few hours earlier, Trump had used the term infest to refer to undocumented people coming to this country. And that's despite the fact that our Attorney General had, in the words of the Reverend David Simmons, who's an Episcopal priest in Wisconsin, had begun publicly interpreting the Bible like a Nazi when he used Romans 13 to justify the family separation policy as biblical. Amnesty International's America's director, Erica Guevara Rosas, said on June 18th that, quote, this family separation policy is a spectacularly cruel policy where frightened children are being ripped from their parents' arms and taken to overflowing detention centers, which are effectively cages. This is nothing short of torture, she said. The severe mental suffering that officials have intentionally inflicted on these families for coercive purposes means that these acts meet the definitions of torture under both U.S. and international law. She continued that there is no question that President Trump's administration separating mothers and fathers from their children is designed to impose severe mental suffering on these families in order to deter others from trying to seek safety in the USA. Many of these families come from countries experiencing generalized violence and grave human rights violations, including Honduras and El Salvador. This is a flagrant violation of human rights of these parents and these children, and it's also a violation of U.S. obligations under refugee law, end quote. Now, the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, Dr. Colleen Kraft, said that Trump's family separation policy amounts to child abuse after she toured one of these detention centers. She said, quote, "I can't describe to you the room I was in with the toddlers. Normally, toddlers are rambunctious and running around. We had one child just screaming and crying, and the others were really silent. And this is not normal activity or brain development with these children." And she said that these facilities will cause a brain development inhibiting condition called toxic stress. And I quote, it disrupts their brain architecture and keeps them from developing language, social, emotional bonds, and gross motor skills, and the development that they could possibly have, end quote. Now, a lot of people are trying to deflect criticism of this policy by labeling it as something that opponents are being hypocritical about. They say that this is not a new policy or that it's very similar to Obama-era policies. That's a lie. According to Denise Gilman, the director of the Immigration Clinic at the University of Texas Law School, the idea that this is simply a continuation of Obama-era practice is preposterous. There were occasionally instances where you would find a separated family, like maybe once every 6 months to a year, and that was usually because there had been some actual individualized concern that there was a trafficking situation or that the parent wasn't actually the parent. According to NBC News, Gilman said that, quote, once custody concerns were resolved, there was pretty immediately reunification. There were not 2,000 kids in 2 months. That is not the same universe, end quote. And I don't want you to be fooled by Trump's recent so-called fix for this crisis either, by the way. According to CBS News, though President Trump declared that the executive order he signed on Wednesday would solve the problem of family separation while parents are prosecuted for illegal border crossings, the order is really only good for 20 days. The order does not override the 1993 Flores versus Reno Supreme Court case, which says that detained migrant children cannot be held in government detention facilities more than 20 days. Essentially, this means that after the 20-day mark, children may still be separated from their parents. Immigration and Customs Enforcement currently separates most families when they are apprehended for illegal border crossing, Reed notes, but now, with the executive order, the Department of Homeland Security will take custody of the entire family. However, at the 20-day mark, under the Flores consent decree, the department will have to release the children from custody. The executive order does not undo or diminish Sessions' zero-tolerance policy, which has caused the spike in parent-child separations at the southern border. Now, I don't have much to say to the minority of Americans who support Trump's family separation policy. People who will rationalize that kind of atrocity, I think they're unreachable. And I think the only way that you beat them is to signal social ostracism for anyone who thinks about joining them, and then driving these folks out of public life by out-organizing them. I think that's your only solution. But to my friends who are worried about the breakdown in civility and who squirm when the word Nazi gets thrown around, I will say this. The problem is not that the rhetoric is intense. The problem is that the situation is intense. Peter Hayes is a historian that writes about how Nazi atrocities happened. He quotes a German aphorism, quote, "Beware the beginnings." There is a reason that the Anti-Defamation League just put out a video with survivors of Hitler's Germany talking about the pain of being separated from their parents. There's a reason that the ADL head Jonathan Greenblatt said there are disturbing parallels with Nazi policies that, quote, "have touched a nerve." There's a reason that even Michael Cohen, Trump's ethically challenged lawyer, drew parallels to Nazi policies when he resigned yesterday, in case you hadn't heard that, saying that, quote, "as the son of a Polish Holocaust survivor, the images and sounds of this family separation policy is heart-wrenching. And while I strongly support measures that will secure our porous borders, children should never be used as bargaining chips," end quote. The reason all these people are saying this is this. Trump's family separation policy fits into a pattern of vile racism and other attempts to legislate that racism into law, alongside his constant praise and admiration for authoritarians and dictators. So yes, When I see a president who called Mexican immigrants rapists and criminals, even though immigrants commit crimes at far lower rates than non-immigrants, who stated that a Mexican-American judge couldn't be fair about the border wall because he was of Mexican descent, who lied about blacks being responsible for most murders of whites, who implied that moral equivalence existed between white supremacists and protesters in Charlottesville, who made infamous shithole countries remarks, who constantly links immigration to MS-13, who uses phrases like animals, infest, etc. about undocumented people, who campaigns on a Muslim ban and then moves to implement that ban when he gets elected to office, and who, after all of that, then implements a policy that separates asylum seekers from their kids on the assumption that they are child traffickers and starts housing those kids in tent cities in triple-digit heat in the middle of the desert. Yes, I compare the president to a Nazi and say that these are proto-Nazi policies. Now, Trump has said that he wants his people to sit up at attention when he speaks, like the leader of North Korea. He half jokes about wanting to serve for longer than allowed for 2 terms and talks about being president for life. He praises Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte for extrajudicial killings for drug suspects, calling it, quote, doing an unbelievable job on the drug problem, end quote. He praised Turkey's Erdogan as getting very high job marks after Erdogan cracked down on Turkish media and political opponents. He did everything but call for the public beating of critical journalists during the 2016 campaign. He is an authoritarian at heart, and he will become an authoritarian in reality the moment he thinks he can get away with it. Now, the only thing that is constraining him at the moment is not the milquetoast civil opposition he's faced inside Congress so far, but the willingness of his opponents at the grassroots level, like you and me, to smash him in the mouth. Trump sort of backed off this policy, not because Pelosi and Schumer managed to appeal to his reason, but because brave people refused to let his DHS secretary enjoy Mexican food in polite society while creating internment camps for kids, and because it was clear that the rest of us were going to continue to escalate grassroots pushback. So if my squeamish friends who worry about the tone of Trump's opponents have concerns, let me say this. If talk of Nazis disturbs you, root out the Nazis and save the tone policing for moments when we aren't separating 10-year-old kids with Down syndrome from their parents for no other reason than to terrorize other immigrants. Beware the beginnings. Thank y'all for listening and watching. Please become a supporter at patreon.com/Derek Crow. The link will be in the description. And please do everything you can, civil or not, to shut down the ugly authoritarian tendencies of this administration and to get those kids back with their parents. Thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate it.